Few figures in all of history are as mysterious, as romanticized, and as misunderstood as the Druids. Say the word, and an image rises immediately. Robed, bearded figures with golden sickles, gathering mistletoe by moonlight, raising standing stones, presiding over human sacrifices in sacred groves, masters of secret wisdom lost to time. Some of this is true, much of it is invention, layered on over the centuries by people who never met a real Druid and used them to dream their own dreams. The genuine Druids were the priests, judges, teachers, philosophers, and keepers of sacred knowledge among the Celtic peoples of ancient Europe, a learned elite of extraordinary power and prestige who held their societies together and who left behind not a single written word of their own. Everything we know about them comes from their enemies, from later legends, and from the silent evidence of archaeology. Today, we are going to untangle the whole strange history of the Druids, who they really were, what they really did, why the Romans feared and destroyed them, and how, more than 1,000 years after the last true Druid vanished, they were reinvented and reborn in the modern imagination. Using advanced AI trained on the accounts of the Greek and Roman writers who described the Celts, the later Irish and Welsh legends that preserved fragments of the Celtic priestly tradition, the archaeology of Celtic religious sites, and the work of modern historians who have carefully separated evidence from myth, we have reconstructed what can actually be known about the Druids. The first thing to understand is the great frustrating fact at the heart of the whole subject. The Druids themselves are silent. The Druids left no writings, and they did so on purpose. The Celtic peoples of ancient Europe were not illiterate. They could and sometimes did write, using borrowed alphabets. But the Druids deliberately refused to commit their sacred knowledge, their teachings, their rituals, and their law to writing. According to the Romans who described them, the Druids believed that writing down their knowledge would weaken it, both by allowing it to fall into unworthy hands and by weakening the memory and the discipline of those who learned it. Instead, all of their vast body of knowledge was transmitted orally, memorized, and passed down by word of mouth from teacher to student across the generations. The training to become a Druid was, by Roman account, extraordinarily long and demanding, taking as much as 20 years of study to master the immense quantity of sacred verse, law, ritual, history, astronomy, and lore that a Druid was required to hold in his memory. This means that when the Druids were destroyed, their knowledge died with them. We have no Druid book, no Druid scripture, no Druid manual. We have only what outsiders said about them, and we must read those outside sources with great care, because almost all of them had reasons to distort what they saw. So who were they, according to the best evidence? The Druids were the intellectual and religious elite of Celtic society, and they were far more than mere priests. They were the keepers of religion, performing the rituals and sacrifices that connected their people to the gods. But they were also the judges and lawgivers, settling disputes, deciding cases, and enforcing justice, with the terrifying power to exclude anyone who defied their rulings from all religious rites, a kind of excommunication that made the offender an outcast, shunned by all. They were the teachers, training the young of the noble classes. They were the keepers of history and genealogy, the memory of the people. They were the philosophers and natural scientists studying the stars, the calendar, the natural world, and the nature of the soul. And they held enormous political power, advising kings and chieftains, and standing, in some respects, above the ordinary tribal divisions, since the Druids of a region formed a learned class that crossed tribal boundaries. They were exempt from taxes and from military service. They were held in the highest honor. A Druid could reportedly step between two armies arrayed for battle and, by his authority alone, command them to lay down their weapons. To be a Druid was to belong to the most powerful and respected class in the entire Celtic world. The Druids taught a doctrine that fascinated and unsettled the Greeks and Romans who heard of it. According to the ancient writers, the Druids taught that the human soul did not die, but passed, after death, into another body, a doctrine of the transmigration of souls. This belief, the Romans noted, made the Celtic warriors astonishingly brave in battle, for if death was not truly an end, but merely a passage to another life, then there was far less reason to fear it. The Druids were deeply concerned with the natural world and the heavens. They studied the movements of the stars and the moon, kept track of the calendar, and timed their festivals and rituals to the cycles of the sun and the seasons. Their worship took place not in temples, but in sacred natural places, in groves of trees, beside springs and rivers, in clearings in the forest. The oak tree and the mistletoe that grew upon it held special sacred significance, and one of the most famous descriptions we have tells of Druids ceremonially cutting mistletoe from a sacred oak with a golden sickle, an image that has stuck in the imagination ever since. And then there is the darkest and most controversial aspect of the Druids: human sacrifice. The Roman writers describe the Druids practicing human sacrifice, claiming that they offered up criminals and prisoners, and sometimes even innocent people, to their gods in order to win divine favor, to foretell the future from the death throes of the victims, or to ensure good harvests and success in war. The most lurid account describes huge figures woven from wicker, filled with living victims, and burned alive as a great offering, the famous and terrible image of the wicker man. Now, we must be cautious here, because the Romans had every reason to portray the Druids as bloodthirsty barbarians. It helped justify conquering and destroying them. So some scholars have suspected exaggeration or propaganda. But archaeology has provided some grim support for the basic claim. Across the Celtic world, archaeologists have found human remains that appear to be the victims of ritual killing, bodies deposited in sacred bogs and pits, some showing signs of having been killed in deliberate, ritualized ways, sometimes by multiple methods at once, as if the death itself were a carefully structured offering. The famous preserved bog bodies, individuals whose remains have survived for thousands of years in the airless peat, include some who appear to have met exactly this kind of ritual death. So while the most dramatic Roman tales may be exaggerated, the underlying reality of Celtic ritual killing seems sadly to be real. It was partly this practice, and partly the Druids' immense political power, that sealed their doom when Rome arrived. As the Romans conquered the Celtic lands of Gaul and then Britain, they found the Druids to be a serious obstacle. The Druids were a focus of resistance, a source of authority that crossed tribal lines and that the Romans could neither control nor co-opt, a learned, powerful, deeply respected class whose influence rivaled that of the chieftains and whose loyalty was to the old gods and the old ways, not to Rome. And so, the Romans set out to destroy them. They outlawed the Druids and their practices, citing the human sacrifice as justification, but driven at least as much by the simple logic of empire. A conquered people is easier to rule once its native leadership and its independent sources of authority have been wiped out. The most famous moment in this destruction came when a Roman army attacked the great Druid stronghold on an island off the coast of Britain, a sacred center of the Druid religion. The Roman historian who recorded the assault described the eerie scene that met the legionaries. Ranks of Druids with their hands raised to the sky, calling down curses, and wild women with torches and streaming hair running among the warriors, a sight so strange and terrible that the Roman soldiers froze in fear before their commanders rallied them. The Romans broke the defenders, slaughtered the Druids, and cut down their sacred groves. It was a deliberate act of religious and cultural annihilation. Under sustained Roman pressure, the Druids of the conquered lands were destroyed, driven underground, or simply faded away as their society was absorbed into the Roman world. But the Druid tradition did not vanish entirely from every corner of the Celtic world. In Ireland, which the Romans never conquered, elements of the old Celtic learned tradition survived longer, evolving over time. And when Ireland eventually became Christian, the monks who wrote down the old Irish legends preserved, in those tales, fragments and memories of the Druids and the pre-Christian Celtic world. It is largely through these later Irish and Welsh legends, written down by Christian scribes centuries after the fact, that we get our richest, though heavily transformed, glimpses of the Celtic spiritual world. The Druids appear in these stories as wizards, prophets, and wise men, their real history blurring into legend and magic. And then, after more than 1,000 years of near silence, the Druids were reborn, not as a living tradition, but as a dream. The modern image of the Druid was largely invented in recent centuries. Beginning a few hundred years ago, antiquarians, romantics, and patriots in Britain became fascinated by the ancient Celtic past and by the mysterious Druids. With almost no real evidence to go on, they let their imaginations run wild. They decided, wrongly, that the Druids had built the great prehistoric stone circles like Stonehenge, monuments that were in fact thousands of years older than the Druids and had nothing to do with them. They invented elaborate Druidic ceremonies, costumes and orders, founding modern fraternal societies that called themselves Druids and performed rituals of their own creation. They wove the Druids into a romantic vision of a noble, mystical, nature-worshipping ancient past. This reinvented Druidry has continued to grow and evolve into modern times, becoming part of the world of modern pagan and nature-based spiritual movements, with people today gathering at ancient stone circles, particularly at the solstices, to celebrate ceremonies that feel ancient but were, in fact, largely created in the modern era. The Druids of the modern imagination are, in a real sense, a creation of the last few centuries, draped over the genuine but fragmentary memory of the real priests of the ancient Celtic world. That was the entire history of the Druids. The learned elite of the ancient Celtic world, priests and judges and teachers and philosophers and keepers of sacred knowledge, who held immense power, who taught that the soul never dies, who worshipped in sacred groves, who may indeed have practiced the dark rituals of human sacrifice, and who refused, to the very end, to write a single word of their wisdom down, so that when Rome destroyed them, their knowledge died with them forever. They were feared by the greatest empire of the ancient world, hunted and slaughtered in their sacred groves, and then, after more than 1,000 years of silence, reborn in the romantic imagination as the robed, mistletoe-cutting mystics we picture today. The truth about them remains tantalizingly out of reach, locked away in the memories of men who chose never to write them down and who took their secrets with them into the silence. Perhaps that is the most fitting fate of all for the Druids, the keepers of secret wisdom, that in the end, their greatest secret, the truth of who they really were, was the one thing they managed to keep forever.